My name is Malik Harrow, and I've never liked making scenes, but that Sunday night I couldn't hide behind silence any longer. We were gathered around the long mahogany table in my parents' dining room. My father, Ronald Harrow, presiding at the head like a king whose kingdom was only just slipping from his grasp. My mother, Eleanor, poised at his side with that practiced look of disapproval that had become her armor. My sister Sienna, fluttering her eyelashes as she spooned mashed potatoes into her mouth. My Aunt Margaret, clutching her iced tea as though it were a lifeline. And half a dozen cousins whose faces reflected everything from curiosity to barely concealed smugness. I sat 2 chairs down from my father, the one spot he had always reserved for me in family photographs and holiday cards. But in that moment it felt like a trap, a place where every eye was trained on me, waiting for me to prove I belonged. I had hoped to slip through dinner unnoticed, to arrive with a polite greeting, exchange a few words about work, and leave without incident, as I always did. Instead, Dad raised his phone high enough that even Aunt Margaret had to look up from her iced tea. "You only sent $10? That's pathetic," he barked, voice slicing through the chatter like a butcher's knife. He pointed at the screen, showing a notification from our bank app with my name and that damning amount. The room froze. The flicker of the chandelier lights danced on the china plates but cast no warmth. My aunt gasped mid-swallow, her iced tea spraying in a fine mist. Cousin Tracy's mouth hung open, the mound of potatoes teetering on her fork. Silence spread like a stain across the table, so viscous that when I tried to speak, my words felt trapped in my throat. "That was me," I said quietly, the 4 syllables a confession I never wanted to make out loud. Dad's face contorted with triumph, as though he had unearthed some long-buried secret. "Jessica sends $4,000 a month," he said, chest puffing with pride, as though boasting of her generosity absolved him of any parental responsibility. I wondered how many times he'd repeated that line in family gatherings, how he'd framed it as a virtue that shone light on his daughter-in-law's kindness while casting me in shadow. My mother leaned forward, voice harsh and clipped. "Stop stealing your wife's credit. Shameless son." That was the moment I realized they didn't see me at all. They saw only a wallet, an ATM dispensing whatever cash they decided was worthy of their favor. I was the invisible provider, the shadow behind the scenes, and they rewarded my sacrifice with contempt. I forced myself to swallow the burn of tears, because crying in front of that audience would have been the ultimate defeat. I wanted to stand up, shout that Jessica had never asked me to do this, that she had nothing to do with it, that I had given every dollar willingly, out of love and duty. But I was trapped by pride and by the suffocating weight of family expectations. So I said nothing, merely bowed my head and picked at the remains of my meal. My mother clicked her tongue and muttered something about ingratitude under her breath. My father leaned back in his chair and folded his arms, triumphant as though he had delivered the final blow in some twisted ritual. Dinner continued, but the air was thick with tension, and the conversation limped along between awkward silences and forced laughter. I heard snippets of small talk. Cousin Elaine complaining about her job, my aunt planning her next charity event, but every word felt like a betrayal of my pain. I forced down a bite of chicken, the skin dry and flavorless, matching the mood in the room. I could barely taste it. When the meal ended, my cousins offered polite goodnights, avoiding eye contact as though I carried some contagious shame. My father nodded at me once, as though to say, "You know your place." I stood, voice hoarse, and excused myself, heading straight for the front door without a backward glance. I felt my mother's gaze sear into my back, but I refused to acknowledge it. Outside, the crisp evening air hit my lungs like redemption. I stood on the porch for a long moment, listening to the muffled voices behind me, and realized something fundamental had shifted. No matter how hard I tried to help, how much I sacrificed, they never saw me. They saw only the money I provided, and even that they refused to acknowledge as mine. I felt the sting of that revelation sharpen into resolve. I would no longer tiptoe around their misconceptions. I would no longer fund their illusions of grandeur. In that instant, I made a decision unlike any I had made before. I would stop the payments. No calls to the bank, no furtive transfers under Jessica's name. I would let the silence speak for me. I closed the door behind me, the click echoing like a final curtain. Inside, my parents returned to their version of normalcy, where appearances mattered more than truth. Outside, I breathed in the cool night air and felt the first stirrings of freedom. I had $10 left in my account for their next request, but I let that sum sit and shrink. because every cent left was a fragment of the respect they never gave. And as I walked down the steps and into the darkness, I understood that sometimes the smallest act of rebellion, a $10 transfer stopped, a door closed, could shatter the illusions of a lifetime of shame. And in that crack of light, I saw for the first time the possibility of being truly seen. They all thought my wife, Jessica, was the one sending the monthly payments because she's vibrant, articulate, the keeper in the family's eyes. But the truth is that for the past 3 years, I had been quietly transferring $4,000 each month from my account into my parents' accounts, always under Jessica's name to make it easier for them and to keep the family from looking too closely at the numbers. Each month I logged into the app, tapped the transfer button, selected Eleanor Harrow or Ronald Harrow, depending on which account needed topping up, and typed in the amount. For $1,000, like clockwork, a sum large enough to cover mortgage shortfalls, overdue dental work, insurance premiums, and Dad's endless parade of suspect car repairs. Jessica never knew the details. I never wanted her to worry or to feel that she had to shoulder the burden I had accepted alone. I told myself it was my duty. They had raised me, supported me through school, and answered my frantic late-night calls as I tried to navigate my first job, first apartment, first adult heartbreak. In my mind, this was repayment in the truest sense, a quiet way of ensuring my parents never had to feel desperation or shame. But now, after that Sunday dinner, the memory of Dad's laughter and Mom's scorn replayed in my head like a broken record, making the small act of generosity feel like grand folly. I left the dinner early, but the echoes of their words trailed me as I drove home. That's pathetic. Shameless, son. You only sent $10? I could almost hear their voices behind me, as though they were shouting through the car's speakers. I stared at the dashboard clock and realized it was already after 10. Jessica would be waiting up, reading or tapping away on her laptop, worrying about a deadline or planning her next client meeting. She'd asked me earlier in the evening if I was all right. I forced a smile when I arrived, told her it was nothing, and she nodded, her eyes kind but curious. You look tired, she said, but she didn't press me. She never pressed me. That was the beginning of the distance between us, the space I carved out in my heart to protect her from my shame. The next morning I woke before dawn, unable to sleep. The habit of making those transfers was so ingrained that for a moment I opened my phone and slid into the banking app without thinking. But as soon as the familiar login screen appeared, I caught myself and closed the app. My thumb hovered above the icon for 5 seconds, and I realized with sudden clarity that nothing in me would allow me to send another dollar. Not after being humiliated, belittled, made to feel worthless in front of my entire family. How could I justify giving them another cent when all they saw was a piggy bank, and none of them saw the person? Once the decision settled in my bones, I felt a weight lift from my chest, a tight coil of resentment and exhaustion unwinding until it felt like air could fill my lungs again. I slipped out of bed, tiptoed past Jessica's side of the mattress, and headed to the kitchen while she slumbered. The coffee maker gurgled to life under my hands and the rich aroma filled the house. But instead of brewing my usual pour-over, I made tea for 2. Jessica would wake soon and find it already steeping. It was the only way I knew to say, without words, that things were changing. I sat at the kitchen table with my phone in hand, drafted an email in my head to the bank's customer support. Please stop scheduled transfers to the following accounts: Eleanor Harrow, Ronald Harrow. Thank you. But I didn't send that email. Instead, I logged into the app again, navigated to scheduled transfers, scrolled down to the recurring one for the Harrow account, tapped Cancel, and confirmed. The familiar rows of numbers, dates, amounts, recipient names vanished, and I felt an odd pang of nostalgia, as though I was breaking up with a part of myself. In that moment, I understood that the money I had given carried more than financial weight. It carried my love, my gratitude, my desire to protect my parents from the pain of comparison, from the fear of being seen as aging and vulnerable. But love doesn't require subservience, and gratitude doesn't demand erasure of the giver. I finished my tea in silence and heard Jessica stir as she rose. She joined me at the table barefoot and ran her finger around the rim of her cup. Good morning, she said softly. She always greeted me with that gentle warmth, as though morning held promise. Morning, I replied, and caught the flicker of something in her eyes, surprise, maybe relief, or perhaps recognition that I seemed at once lighter and more distant. We sat across from each other, a comfortable quiet enveloping us until I finally spoke. I stopped the transfers, I said, voice steady. Jessica's hand paused on the saucer. I watched her face as she processed what I had said. There was no anger, no shock, only a stillness that reached into me and loosened something I had kept locked away. She set her cup down and offered me a small, sad smile. I'm glad, she said. You should have stopped years ago. Relief swelled in me, fierce and unexpected. For the first time, I felt seen, not as a bank account, but as a man with limits, with pride, with a right to control his own generosity. The day stretched out in front of me, bright and uncluttered by obligations to a family who refused to honor the person behind the payments. I took a deep breath and realized that cutting off the money was only the first step. The next would be setting boundaries, demanding respect, and perhaps facing the anger and confusion of those who had grown accustomed to living off my sacrifice. But in that morning light, with Jessica by my side, I felt ready to meet whatever came. I poured us each another cup of tea and watched her take the first sip, then mine, as though we were toasting a new beginning. I hadn't just stopped a transfer, I had started reclaiming my own worth. And that realization, more than any sum of money, felt like the greatest gift I could ever give myself. When I told Jessica that I had stopped the payments, there was no dramatics, no raised voices, just that familiar quiet of our kitchen in the early evening. The golden light of the setting sun filtering through the curtains and scattering across the table where two half-washed mugs sat side by side. I watched her set down the wooden spoon she'd been using to stir her tea, her brow knitting for a fraction of a second before she relaxed, as if she expected this news all along. She didn't lean forward to interrogate me or recoil in surprise. Instead, she tilted her head and met my eyes, and I felt exposed in the best possible way, as though all the charade of using her name to feed my family had been stripped away, leaving just the two of us, honest and vulnerable. You should have stopped 2 years ago, she said simply, voice gentle but unwavering. Those words landed in my chest like the soft click of a lock snapping open, and in that silence that followed I realized she didn't need explanations or apologies. She needed me to see that my worth didn't lie in how many dollars I could send her parents or how quietly I could subsidize their lives. She'd understood from the start. I could see it in the tilt of her lips, in the way her eyes glimmered with both compassion and resolve. We were seated at our small round table, the one I'd bought when we first moved in, determined to furnish our life one piece at a time rather than inherit a ready-made existence. I arranged my hands around my mug to warm them, nails catching on the chipped glaze, and finally exhaled the burden I'd been carrying, shame mixed with relief. I thought I was doing the right thing, I said, voice rough with emotion. I wanted them to feel supported, not to struggle. But I never wanted to feel this way, like I was nothing but an ATM. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing mine, an almost tentative gesture that grew firmer as she spoke. They didn't deserve your kindness if this is how they repaid you. Her words were a declaration of solidarity, and I felt something crack open inside me, the part that had been hardened by years of quiet sacrifice and silent resentment. I saw myself reflected in her eyes, not as the invisible provider, but as a partner worthy of respect. She understood the weight I'd shouldered, the everyday calculus of deciding whether to pay rent or cover Dad's insurance premium, and she didn't judge me for ceding control. She simply recognized the cost it had exacted on my spirit. In that moment, our cramped kitchen felt vast, buoyed by the possibility of a shared life where neither of us would be asked to hide our contributions or wear them like chains. She stood and crossed the room to the counter, where she opened the cupboard and took down 2 plates. She smiled softly, almost shyly, and said, I think we deserve something better than tea and whatever's in the pantry. Let's have takeout, Indian. I nodded, feeling joy bubble up that such a small suggestion could feel revolutionary. Indian sounds perfect. As she dialed our favorite place, I watched her profile, her hair pulled back in a loose bun, a stray curl dancing against her neck, and I thought of all the times she'd been my anchor. The nights she talked me through deadlines I thought I couldn't meet, the morning she greeted me with breakfast and laughter, the afternoon she held my hand when I had bad dreams about disappointing everyone around me. She'd never once complained about being named as the benefactor. She'd let me protect my pride in my own way. Now, I realized, she had been protecting me the entire time. When the order confirmation pinged on her phone, she showed me the screen as if it were a small victory. Butter chicken, samosas, garlic naan, mango lassi. The choices felt decadent, frivolous even, after months of austerity measures dictated by my parents' purported needs. But tonight, I understood, the feast was for my soul. We ate on mismatched plates, elbows brushing, feet propped on chairs because we never bothered with formalities in our apartment. We talked about our days, her big presentation at work, the new client she was excited about, the book she'd started reading. While I listened, letting the aroma of spices and the warmth of her presence chase away the aftertaste of shame. Between bites, she asked how I felt, and I admitted that I felt free, as though I had been holding my breath for years and only now discovered I could exhale. She reached across again and squeezed my hand, and the contact was an affirmation of everything we were building together: honesty, mutual support, and the refusal to be diminished by people who valued appearances over authenticity. After dinner, we moved to the couch with our mugs refilled, now with hot cocoa, and curled up under a blanket, the apartment echoing with the distant hum of the city. She rested her head on my shoulder, and I draped my arm across her back. I felt her steady breathing, the soft rhythm that had lulled me to sleep countless nights before, and I vowed that from now on, I would let her see every part of me, the strengths and the vulnerabilities, the generosity and the boundaries I needed to draw. In her arms, I realized, I could be both giver and equal partner, without apology. Later, when we turned off the lights and slipped into bed, I felt lighter than I had in years. I looked at her silhouette, traced by the moonlight, and whispered, "Thank you." She murmured back, half asleep, "Thank you for trusting me." And in that exchange, I understood that the real support I needed had always been beside me, not across a family table clouded with judgment. I drifted into sleep believing that the truth, once it is claimed openly, loses its power to wound. In the morning, we would face whatever fallout came from my parents discovering the payments had ceased, but we would face it together, as partners who saw and honored each other's worth. And for the first time in a long time, I slept without the weight of invisible bills pressing down on my chest, because Jessica had known the truth all along, and that knowledge had set me free. The morning of my birthday dawned like any other day. Gray skies, a too loud alarm, the familiar ache in my shoulders that came from too many late nights at the office, but I felt a restless energy crackling underneath it all, as though the universe had conspired to make this day matter. Jessica stirred beside me, planting a soft kiss on my neck before slipping out of bed to start coffee. I lay there for a moment, listening to the rhythmic scrape of the mug against the cupboard and the low hum of the machine. This was our ritual: 2 mugs, strong black coffee for her and sweet, milky tea for me, delivered to the bed while we planned our day. But today, something felt off. I checked my phone before even reaching for it, half expecting to see birthday greetings piling up, texts, social media notifications, maybe a call from my sister. Instead, the screen displayed the empty lock screen wallpaper I'd set months ago, a foggy road flanked by trees. No chimes, no balloons, no happy birthday. Just the silent countdown of minutes passed. My heart sank, but I told myself not to read too much into it. People got busy, things slipped their minds. I rolled over and stared at the ceiling, tracing the cracks in the plaster. Last year, my family had thrown me a small party: cake, a haphazard banner, Aunt Margaret's infamous potato salad. It had been awkward, yes, but I'd left feeling seen, if only for a few hours. This year, after I'd pulled the plug on their monthly stipend, I suspected the omens were worse than mere forgetfulness. I slipped out of bed quietly and joined Jessica in the kitchen. She handed me my mug and offered me that gentle smile she reserved for days when I needed to be reminded that I was loved. "Happy birthday," she whispered, brushing back a strand of hair that had escaped her bun. The warmth of her gaze was enough to steady my nerves, but I kept my expression neutral as I sipped my tea. "Morning," I replied. She tilted her head, curiosity mingled with concern. "You okay?" she asked. I shrugged, forcing a laugh. "Just forgot it was today," I said, even though I couldn't remember ever forgetting before. She reached across and squeezed my hand. "Let's not let it slip by. Why don't we do something tonight? Dinner? A movie? Just us?" I nodded, but my mind was elsewhere. All day, I worked with a quiet desperation I'd never experienced, drafting emails, attending meetings, typing until my fingers blurred. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart jumped, only to fall when the screen showed nothing but another promotional alert or a message from a colleague. By mid-afternoon, the ache in my chest had thickened into a lump I couldn't swallow. I went outside for a walk, hoping fresh air would clear my head. The city streets thrummed with life, children playing in sprinklers, couples strolling hand in hand, friends laughing over ice cream cones. But I felt like a ghost drifting through the crowd, unseen and unheard. Heads turned around me, but never toward me. I imagined a world where birthdays came and went unnoticed, The way a tree loses its leaves in autumn, inevitable, unremarkable, lonely. When I returned home, the sky was draped in slate and the first drops of rain began to fall. Jessica greeted me with a soft smile and a plate of homemade chicken soup, my favorite comfort food, steam rising in little rings that disappeared almost instantly. She'd even lit 2 small candles and placed them on top. For a moment, I felt the familiar tug of gratitude, but I couldn't let myself be comforted yet. I ate in silence, savoring each spoonful while she sat across the table, watching me. "You know," she said between sips, "you deserve better than this." I looked up, surprised by the fierceness in her tone. "I know," I whispered. She set her spoon down and reached for my hand across the table, crossing the narrow strip of polished wood that separated us. "You're important to me," she said, voice low and steady. "And I'm going to make sure you know that today." I wanted to believe her, wanted to feel that kindness fill the empty spaces inside me, but all I felt was the ghost of what should have been. After dinner, I changed into the jacket I'd bought for special occasions and we headed out into the early evening drizzle. The city lights glimmered on wet pavement like sparks in the dark, and I wondered if somewhere, my family was raising glasses, clinking forks, toasting the provider they'd come to worship, and if they would raise the same to me. My phone remained stubbornly silent, tucked deep in my pocket. I felt every minute stretch out longer than the last. Finally, we arrived at the restaurant Jessica had picked, a small bistro tucked behind a row of shops, simple decor, soft lighting, exactly the kind of place I would have loved even before my world had cracked. She led me to a corner table near the window, where she'd reserved the spot with a view of the street. My jacket brushed the back of the chair as I sat, the fabric unfamiliar against my skin. I forced a smile for her, and she returned it with warmth. We ordered wine, her favorite Pinot Noir, my first glass of anything since I cut out the monthly payments, and the sommelier poured carefully, letting the liquid swirl in the glass. "We toasted to new beginnings," she said, and the clink of crystal between us echoed in the hushed room. For a few moments, I allowed myself to believe I could start fresh here, that nothing else mattered beyond the woman in front of me and the empty chair I chose not to fill. We spoke of light things, our upcoming vacation, the new book club Jessica had joined, the absurdity of Dad's retirement party looming on the horizon. I laughed at her jokes, felt my shoulders unclench, and thought perhaps the day wouldn't end in complete desolation. Then, midway through the main course, my phone buzzed with a notification I couldn't ignore. A tagged photo from my sister on social media. I turned the phone toward me, heart pounding. The image showed Mom, Dad, Sienna, and Aunt Margaret gathered at a steakhouse banquet table, gold candles flickering, white balloons floating in the background. They were all smiling, leaning in as they held a large cake, chocolate layers, birthday message scrawled in frosting that read, "Happy 40th, Malik." Only it was my name on the balloons, my name on the cake, but I was absent. My sister had tagged me as though I needed to see the scene unfold without me. The caption read, "Celebrating strength in real providers clinking glasses #family first." Real providers. I stared at those words and felt something inside me fracture. The irony was vicious. My family, the ones who refused to acknowledge me, the ones who called me shameless and pathetic in my own home, were now celebrating a provider who didn't exist because they refused to see the real one. I felt rage and hurt combing together, a wild tangle of emotion. I looked up at Jessica, her brow furrowed in concern. I swiped the screen shut without comment, sliding the phone back into my pocket. She reached for my hand again, but I pulled mine away, standing abruptly. Chairs scraped against the floor. Other diners turned to watch. I didn't care. I felt the heat rise in my face as tears threatened to spill. "I'm sorry," I said, voice trembling so badly I had to clear my throat. I swallowed hard. "I need to go." Before she could stop me, I left the table, the sounds of dinner receding behind me as I stormed into the night. Rain pelted my jacket, dissolved the tension in my muscles, but not the ache in my heart. The streetlights blurred as I ran down the block, away from the bistro, away from the image of a birthday celebration that had become my mirror, reflecting everything I was to them, invisible. I stopped under a flickering neon sign outside a closed bookstore, chest heaving, the damp air stinging my lungs. I fished my phone back out and stared at the screen, the photo still there if I unlocked it. My thumb hovered over the delete button, and I pressed. I deleted the image, erased the tag, but I couldn't delete the memory burning in my mind. I slid the phone into my pocket and looked up at the empty street before me. The birthday I'd thought would haunt me all day had come and gone in a single moment of cruelty. But in that moment, I realized something vital. I had the power to walk away from their phantom celebration, to reclaim my own life beyond the ghost of their approval. I marched back toward the bistro, rain washing away the last of my hesitation, and pushed open the door. Jessica stood at the host's desk, concern etched across her face. She met my eyes, and in that silent exchange I saw everything I needed to know. I wasn't alone. I stepped forward, embraced her, and whispered, "Thank you for seeing me." She kissed my forehead, and together we walked back into the night, into a future where birthdays would be ours again, meaningful not for empty praise, but for the love we chose to share. 3 weeks later, my phone rang just after dawn and awakened me with a jolt of dread so sharp it curdled the warm pool of sleep I'd only just found. I rubbed my hand over my eyes and glanced at the screen. Dad. My heart thumped like a drum roll of disaster. We hadn't spoken in nearly a month, not since that evening of cold silence after the retirement party. I hesitated before answering, as though I could choose not to pick up, but the phone buzzed insistently in my hand, and the guilt of cutting him off gnawed at me. "Hey, Malik." His voice trembled on the line, unfamiliar in its uncertainty. Weird question. You know anything about Jessica's payment this month? It never came. The words landed like icy hailstones on the roof of my chest. I could almost hear the tremor in his voice, the careful hedging of embarrassment he always used when he was confused or caught off guard. I let a few seconds of silence stretch before answering, wanting him to feel at least a fraction of the bewilderment he'd inflicted on me. "I wouldn't know," I said quietly, measured, and allowed him to fill the void. He cleared his throat. "She said she tried to send it, but the transfer didn't go through. We thought maybe there was a glitch with the bank." "Glitches happen," I replied, keeping my voice calm. "Maybe double-check the account details?" He grunted. Yeah. Then, in a softer tone, "Okay. Sorry to bother you." The line went dead before I could utter a word more. I sat on the edge of my bed, pulse pounding, aware of each rapid breath in my chest. My hand hovered over the phone as though I might dial him back and confess, but shame coiled around my throat, cutting off any impulse to admit my actions. It was a moment of unspoken reckoning. My parents had believed Jessica was behind the lifeline I'd so carefully provided, and now that the money had vanished, their world was wobbling on its axis. I tossed the phone aside, dressed quickly, and moved through the apartment in a haze. Jessica emerged from the bedroom clutching her laptop, still in pajamas, her hair a tousled halo around her face. "Everything okay?" she asked softly. I shook my head, tracing my fingers through my hair. "Dad called. They didn't get this month's transfer." Her eyes widened, but only for a fraction of a second before she closed them and exhaled. "Good," she said, matter of fact. "Probably about time they noticed." My heart lurched. She poured us both black coffee and placed the mugs on the counter with a finality that both stung and soothed. "What did you expect?" she asked, voice calm. "They've been living off your generosity for years." I pressed my lips together and stared at my mug, swirling the dark liquid as though it might reveal hidden truths. "I know," I whispered. "I just didn't realize how they'd react." She set her hand on my shoulder, her touch firm. "Let them panic. Let them squirm. They needed a reminder that nothing is owed to them." Together, we sat in charged silence, the hum of the coffee maker our only soundtrack. I felt a rush of something like exhilaration mixed with guilt. For the first time, I was wielding power over the family dynamic, and it tasted strange and heady. After a moment, I excused myself and left for the office, each step echoing in the quiet hallway with the weight of what was to come settling in my gut. All day, I tried to bury the thought under spreadsheets, conference calls, and drafting client proposals, but every time my phone buzzed with a calendar alert or a text from a colleague, I braced for another call from Ronald. And sure enough, 2 days later, my phone dinged with a message from an unknown number. I unlocked it to see, "Hi, Jessica. This is Eleanor. We hope you're okay. Nothing from your end. Is everything all right with the account?" My chest tightened. I felt hot anger and foolish guilt war in my veins. I glanced over at the screen, wondering if I should press delete or reply, but couldn't bring myself to do either. Moments later, I found Jessica hovering in the doorway, phone in hand and a small smile playing on her lips. "Mom texted you," she said, showing me the screen. I nodded, voice dry. "Yeah." She shrugged, as though it were the most natural thing in the world that her mother-in-law would check on her. "Let her worry," she said. "She'll learn." I closed my eyes for a second, visualizing my mother reading that text, fingers hovering over the keyboard as she tried to craft a message that didn't betray her panic. In my mind's eye, I saw her brow furrow as she reread the amount in the account statement email, disbelief curdling into fear, fear swelling into outrage. Maybe Dad would call again, this time not to question, but to plead. Maybe he'd demand I restore the flow of money that he'd come to count on as his birthright. I thought of Sienna, shopping sprees and fake job leads, of Aunt Margaret's iced tea and half-finished potatoes, of the retirement party speeches and hollowed-out praise for a provider who didn't exist. The realization was brutal and satisfying in equal measure. They had trapped themselves in a lie of their own making, and now I held the key to unlock the truth and shatter the illusion. That evening, I found myself unable to concentrate on dinner. I poked at the food on my plate while Jessica recounted her day, outlining new client pitches and office gossip. I nodded along, but my mind raced ahead to my parents' utter confusion when the email alert arrived, monthly transfer failed. It had been so easy to cancel the recurring instruction, a few taps on my phone, and, "Are you sure?" prompt, and the confirmation. No emails followed confirming the cancellation, just radio silence on their end until they, or rather, my mother, decided to investigate. After dinner, I stood at the kitchen sink and stared at the soapy water swirling around my hands. Should I call them back? I asked Jessica over my shoulder. She stepped up beside me, dried her hands on a towel, and took my elbow. "No," she said firmly. "Don't. Let them figure it out on their own. If you do, you'll just bail them out of the panic you created." I tightened my jaw, admiring her strength. She was right, of course, but a small part of me recoiled at the thought of watching my parents flounder without me, like stepping back to let a child sink in the pool rather than reach out a hand. But this wasn't about sparing them discomfort. It was about ending a cycle of entitlement and disrespect. I drained the water, and we dried off together, standing side by side under the kitchen light that felt suddenly too bright, too revealing. "Tomorrow," I said softly, "I'll be ready for their calls." She kissed the top of my head, quiet pride radiating from her. I know. That night, I dreamt I was sitting at our old family table, a single candle flickering at the center. The room was empty, save for my father's phone on the table, its screen glowing with my canceled transfers. I watched row after row of past payments vanish from the ledger, and with them, the phantom of gratitude my parents held onto so tightly. In the dream, I closed the communal ledger and slid the table out from under me, until I was suspended in darkness, alone but free, weightless of shame and fueled by resolve. I woke before dawn again, heart hammering, with sweat soaking my shirt. The room was silent except for the buzzing of the utility meter outside. I lay there for a moment, listening to my own breath, knowing that with this act of withholding I'd crossed a threshold I could never uncross. The next day, Dad called again, voice trembling with frustration rather than confusion. "Malik, come on, son, don't make this harder than it has to be." I felt a cold thrill run through me as I let the phone ring 5 times before I picked it up. When I answered, my voice was calm and distant, a mirror of his own tone from 3 weeks prior. I wouldn't know anything about that. And then I hung up. Silence stretched across the line, one-sided and final. I exhaled slowly, and on the other end, I sensed the weight of disappointment settling in his chest. Finally, I felt the sting of power, the painful kind that only comes when you've chosen not to rescue someone who always expected to be saved. In that silence, I understood that sometimes withholding what is expected breaks more than a pattern. It breaks the illusion of unearned loyalty, and in that fracture, honesty and respect might begin to seep through. And as I lowered the phone, I realized I was ready to face whatever came next, grounded by the knowledge that I was no longer the invisible provider, but the man who chose to be visible, for the first time in years, to myself. I hired Miles Grady, a discreet accountant and investigator whose reputation for uncovering hidden finances was as hushed as it was formidable, because I knew I needed more than rumors and half-truths to confront my family. I met him in the corner booth of a quiet coffee shop downtown, where the aroma of espresso masked our conversation and the plush seats offered a measure of privacy. Miles arrived in a tailored charcoal suit, carrying a slim briefcase and an unreadable expression. He greeted me with a curt nod and slid into the seat opposite me. "You're Malik Harrow," he said, voice low. "Your wife referred you." I nodded, taking a moment to study him. Sharp eyes that missed nothing, fingers long and poised as though they belonged to a pianist. I pushed a manila envelope across the table. "Everything you have on their accounts," I said. "Transaction history, bank statements, any related correspondence. And I need to know who's spending what, where the money is going, and whether any of it was funneled through shell accounts or ATMs. He opened the envelope, leafed through the printouts, and closed it with deliberate calm. "Give me a week," he said. "I'll build a digital report. Transparent, comprehensive, bulletproof." I exhaled, the tension in my shoulders easing for the first time in days. We shook hands and parted, and I walked back to my car feeling that I was finally moving toward clarity instead of spiraling in doubt. That night, I lay awake thinking of all the lies we told ourselves. My parents insisting Sienna had income when she'd been jobless for months. Mom claiming the monthly transfer covered utilities and medical bills while she shopped at luxury boutiques. Dad boasting of fiscal prudence all while his own expenses eclipsed the sum I provided. The injustice of it burned in my gut. In the days that followed, I went about my routine: work, home, dinners with Jessica, but beneath the surface my mind churned with anticipation of the report. I pored over old emails and texts I'd saved. Exchanges with my parents thanking Jessica for her generosity, messages from Sienna boasting about new dresses or spur-of-the-moment trips, and group chat screenshots where they joked about how much she spoiled them. But it wasn't until the evening of the 7th day that my phone buzzed with a message from Miles. "Report ready. Confidential download link sent." I closed my laptop with reverent care, opened the secure portal, and downloaded a folder labeled Simply Truth. Inside were 3 subfolders: transfers, spending, and communications. I clicked the first file in transfers and watched rows of bank statements unfold on my screen. Exact dates, amounts, account numbers, all labeled as outgoing transfers from my account but credited to my parents. Every single one matched the $4,000 withdrawals I'd initiated. There were no extra funds, no deviations, exactly 36 transfers, each tagged gift, under the memo line. My chest tightened as I scrolled, seeing my own name listed alongside the family accounts I'd struggled to support. Then I opened spending and found Sienna's credit card bills, flagged transactions for high-end department stores, electronics retailers, and luxury spas. The fat balance each month was automatically paid by transfers from Mom's account, which itself was funded by my own bank. The irony was bitter. I had unwittingly subsidized a charade in which they masqueraded as self-sufficient. I clicked through dozens of statements, each more incriminating than the last: designer handbags, jewelry store receipts, 5-star hotel charges, gourmet grocery deliveries. I felt a surge of righteous anger rise in me, tempered by the cold satisfaction of having evidence so damning that no denial could withstand it. Finally, I opened communications, where Miles had compiled screenshots from family group chats. Messages from Aunt Margaret mocking me for being clueless, text from Cousin Tracy plotting to mention Jessica's generosity at Ronald's retirement party, and even a forwarded email from Dad to a friend praising the real MVP, my daughter-in-law. In each snippet, they referred to me as expendable, a prop in their narrative of wealth and propriety. I sat back, absorbing the scope of their deception. 3 neatly labeled digital files held the truth of 3 years of betrayal: my money, their lies, and the jesting messages that undercut my dignity. Heat thrummed in my temples as I realized how carefully they had constructed their illusion, all while I silently maintained their comfort. I closed my laptop and paced the room, hands clenched into fists at my sides. My thoughts flickered to the upcoming retirement party: 60 well-dressed guests, speeches lauding Dad's legacy, champagne flutes raised to the family's silent blessing. The time to confront them was near. That night, I printed the key documents: the 3 years of bank transfers, Sienna's spending summary, and the chat transcripts. I placed each stack into a crisp white envelope, sealing them with red wax stamps I'd ordered for the occasion. There were exactly 3 envelopes, just as the truth had 3 parts. As I laid them side by side on my desk, I felt a tremor of anticipation. The evidence was irresistible, irrefutable. I reviewed each envelope. Folder 1. Bank transfers. 36 payments totaling $144,000. Folder 2. Sienna's spending, $82,700 and personal charges. Folder 3. Communications. 47 chat transcripts. The labels were clinical, devoid of emotion, because I wanted no room for argument. The cold precision of documentation was my shield against their frantic denials. Later, I called Jessica into my study and showed her the envelopes. She read the labels, her brow knitting momentarily, then looked up at me with a fierce pride shining in her eyes. "This is perfect," she said. "They won't know how to respond." We discussed our plan. I would distribute the envelopes at Dad's party, slide them onto the podium before my toast, and then watch the order of revelations unfold. We rehearsed my introduction, the way I would ask the audience's attention, the calm with which I would reveal that she had never sent a single cent. She reminded me to speak slowly, to let each line settle before proceeding. The meticulousness of our strategy stemmed from our shared desire for impact, not revenge. I wanted accountability, not a spectacle. With the envelopes prepared and our script memorized, I finally slept that night, a sense of purpose replacing the anxiety I'd carried for months. In my dreams, I saw the family's faces, confusion, disbelief, shame, as the documents lay bare their duplicity. I woke at dawn feeling a clarity I had never known before. Truth, once distilled and delivered with precision, had the power to shatter illusions and rebuild respect. As I dressed that morning, I thought of my younger self, a boy eager for approval, always striving to be enough. Now, I was ready to demand that they see me, whole and unmasked. With the 3 envelopes tucked into my briefcase, I stepped outside into the crisp morning air and walked toward the next chapter of my life, one where silence would no longer shield betrayal and where the truth would finally compel them to look at me. The day of my father's retirement party arrived with a crisp clarity that felt almost preordained, as though every sunrise had been counting down to this moment. I woke before dawn, my mind already running through the evening's choreography, greeting guests, offering small talk, raising a glass, then, at the apex, delivering my truth toast. The 3 envelopes sat on my desk like silent sentinels, each bearing a simple, precise label. Folder 1, Bank Transfers, Folder 2, Sienna Spending, and Folder 3, Communications. I dressed deliberately in a charcoal suit, crisp white shirt, and deep navy tie, colors that both honored the occasion and framed my seriousness. Jessica touched the knot of my tie and whispered, "You're ready." Her calm confidence grounded me as I slipped the envelopes into the inner pocket of my blazer. The venue was a polished banquet hall in the heart of town, its high ceilings gilded with ornate moldings and its walls draped in ivory drapery. A long head table dominated the center of the room, reserved for the Harrow family and our closest guests. I arrived early, passing beneath a canopy of twinkling fairy lights that cast gentle patterns of light on the marble floor. Servers in black vests carried trays of champagne flutes and canapes, the air buzzed with polite laughter and the fragrance of roses. My parents, immaculately dressed, stood at the end of the head table, exchanging pleasantries with the mayor and the CEO of Dad's former company. Everywhere I looked I saw anticipation, family friends murmuring about Dad's legacy, colleagues patting him on the back, distant relatives marveling at the occasion. But amid all the applause and accolades, I felt an undercurrent of arrogance in Dad's posture, as though he believed this party to be his ultimate vindication. I slipped behind the podium to place the envelopes just out of view, stacking them neatly in a line. The first envelope would shatter the narrative of gratitude they'd spun for Jessica, the second would expose Sienna's deceit, the third would reveal the mocking messages they had shared behind my back. I smoothed my palms on the podium wood and allowed myself one steadying breath. From behind, I heard Aunt Margaret's familiar voice. "Oh, I simply cannot wait for his speech." Cousin Tracy tittered in agreement. I forced a smile and leaned in to congratulate them on Dad's milestone, then melted back into the shadowed corridor. At precisely 7 o'clock, the room fell into hushed attention as one of Dad's longtime friends, Mr. Whitaker, gave a warm introduction. He spoke of loyalty, family, and the example set by Ronald Harrow over 4 decades of dedication. I watched Dad's chest swell with pride as the applause washed over him. When the clapping subsided, Dad raised his glass and said, "To my son-in-law, the one who keeps this family afloat." He gestured toward me, beaming, and everyone followed his gaze. A ripple of laughter and nods spread around the table, and I felt a dull tremor of anger spark in my veins. When Dad sat down, I rose with measured calm. The room tilted slightly as all eyes fixed on me. The retirees, the businessmen in suits, the socialites in cocktail dresses, my parents, Mom's powdered face unreadable, Dad's smile faltering. I placed my glass on the podium and cleared my throat. "If I may," I said, voice low but carrying. My words echoed in the hush. "I'd like to offer a short toast of my own." As I spoke, I reached for the first envelope, detached it, and set it beside my glass. Envelope 1 contains our family's bank transfer records from the past 3 years. Every single transfer of $4,000 was sent by me, Malik Harrow, from my personal account. Jessica, my wife, never initiated a single transaction. Confusion rippled through the crowd. I let the moment stretch, Watching Aunt Margaret's eyes widen, Cousin Tracy clutch her pearls, Sienna's jaw drop. This envelope, I continued, proves what I chose to give, and reveals that the praise often directed at Jessica was misplaced. A murmur rose as some guests leaned forward, curious, incredulous, listening as the air thickened with charged silence. I moved to the second envelope, lifting it with a ceremonious pause. Envelope 2 outlines my sister Sienna's financial records, luxury purchases, extravagant sprees, personal expenses, all paid for with funds I provided under false pretenses. I slid the envelope aside, and the room erupted into gasps. Sienna stood, lips quivering, her eyes darting around the hall. I can explain, she stammered, but her voice trailed off into the din of shocked whispers. My mother's hands flew to her mouth, and Dad's face drained of color. A hush rebounded off the walls as I reached for the third envelope. When I said I wanted to be seen, I said, voice steady, I also needed you all to recognize the words you'd whispered behind my back. I tapped the third envelope. Envelope 3 contains group chat transcripts, messages mocking me, planning how to credit Jessica with my efforts, and even referring to me as useful. I paused, feeling the tension from like a live wire in the room. Cousin Tracy's cheeks burned. Aunt Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. Usefulness, I said softly, returning my gaze to where my parents Saturday. It turns out I was only as valuable as the dollars I sent. I swallowed the last bitter syllable and allowed silence to reign. The guests sat motionless, forks in midair, glasses untouched, as the three envelopes lay on the podium like a lineup of verdicts. Mom rose first, trembling. Malik, this is... Her voice cracked, but she could not finish. Dad sprang to his feet, face red, eyes wild. How dare you betray? He began, then faltered as he noticed the phones illuminating the transcripts on screens. The guests exchanging secrets gleaned from those files. I did what any son would. Dad spat, voice low. I provided for my parents. I held up a hand. You provided for yourselves? I said, at my expense. Sienna wept in the seat beside them, shame stripping away her vanity. The laughter, once warm, had dissolved into stunned silence. I stepped back, raised my glass one final time, and offered a quiet blessing. To truth, however painful, and to the respect we earn when we acknowledge the real provider. Then I turned and walked away, the applause of a few sympathetic colleagues rising behind me like a hesitant tide. I exited the hall and found Jessica waiting at the entrance, her eyes luminous with pride and relief. She slipped her hand into mine, and together we walked into the cool night air, leaving behind the gilded illusions of a family that had chosen false praise over genuine gratitude. The three envelopes remained on the podium, heavy with the weight of secrets finally laid bare. And as we stepped into our future, I knew that in confronting their deception, I had, at last, been truly seen. The hall was heavy with anticipation when my father lowered his microphone after his speech, brushing off sweat from his brow as though he believed he had already sealed his legacy. I rose from my seat, smoothing the front of my jacket, and walked with calm purpose back to the podium where the three envelopes lay like silent witnesses. The murmur of conversation dimmed to curious whispers. I lifted the first envelope by its corner, its weight familiar in my hand, and tapped it gently. If I may offer a few words, I began, voice steady enough to carry across the room. My parents exchanged nervous glances, and their friends straightened in their seats. Envelope 1 contains every transaction I made to our family over the last 3 years, 36 payments of $4,000 each. Every transfer was sent by me, not Jessica. I paused, letting the shock settle before continuing. She never sent a dime. A ripple of astonished gasps cut through the room. I watched as eyes darted between my parents and the envelope. Aunt Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Sienna leaned forward, face pale. I set the first envelope down and picked up the second. Envelope 2 reveals Sienna's expenditures, luxury shopping sprees, travel bookings, and personal indulgences, all funded by the money I provided under the false assumption that it was Jessica's generosity. Head snapped toward my sister, and she shrank in her seat, her voice lost in the rising murmur. My mother's cheeks flushed a deep red. Holding the third envelope, I met my father's eyes. Envelope 3 contains your messages, group chats, and private texts, where you celebrated Jessica as the family's silent blessing and mocked me as merely useful. I tapped the envelope. Useful. The single word echoed. The guests fell silent, the room stretching into a tense void. My father's face crumpled. Malik, this is... he began, but his voice cracked under the weight of his own shame. I held up a hand, stopping him. I chose to support you because I loved you. But love shouldn't be repaid with disrespect. I swept my arm toward the gathered envelopes. Respect is earned in honesty, not manufactured in silence. My mother's eyes glistened as she looked at the documents spread before her. Sienna pressed her hands to her mouth, tears glinting in her eyes. A hush reigned for a heartbeat longer, then a scattering of applause from colleagues and friends who recognized the courage it took to stand here, to shatter the illusion. I closed my eyes briefly, savoring the affirmation. When I opened them, I saw Jessica standing near the back, her expression proud and unwavering. I placed the third envelope down and stepped back from the podium. Thank you, I said simply, voice softer now. Not for the money, but for finally seeing me. With that, I turned and walked away, each step lighter than the last. As I passed my family's stunned faces, I felt a shift, an unspoken reckoning taking root. Outside, the night air was cool against my skin. Jessica slipped her hand into mine, and together we left behind the gilded hall and its hollow praises, stepping into a future built on truth, on respect, and on the unbreakable bond between us. I stepped away from the podium into the silent swirl of stunned faces, the weight of what I'd revealed still echoing in my chest, and I saw Sienna standing at the head table, trembling as though caught in a sudden storm. Her lips quivered, but no words came. The proud, entitled girl I'd known was gone, replaced by someone unmoored. For a moment, I wondered if she might lash out, blame me for appending her comfortable lie, but instead she stared at the 3 envelopes, one for payment records, one for her spending, one for the mocking messages, and then she looked at me. Really looked at me, as though seeing a stranger made of truth. My mother sat beside her, face pale, eyes unfocused, clutching the edge of the tablecloth like a lifeline. Dad had slumped into his chair, the defiant swagger gone from his shoulders, replaced by the hollow slump of a man stripped of his illusions. I felt a swell of pity, then remembered the years I'd sacrificed. Pity could not outweigh justice. Cousin Tracy's murmur rippled through the guests. He wasn't bitter. He was buried. The words hung in the air like a confession. I realized they'd finally understood what I'd been for so long, not the charitable son-in-law they applauded, but the silent caretaker they looked past. I met my father's eyes, and in his expression I saw the sheen of remorse. His mouth opened and closed, searching, before he looked away. That's when I spoke again, my voice softer but no less firm. I didn't come here to destroy anyone. I came to be recognized. I glanced toward Jessica, standing tall at the back, her presence an unwavering beacon of support. All I ever wanted was for you to see me, not as a source of funds, but as your son, your brother, and your husband. A breath caught in my throat as I let the words settle. Then Sienna rose, a hesitant movement that drew every eye. She took 2 uncertain steps forward, hands twisting at her sides. Malik, she began, voice small. I'm sorry. The apology trembled into the hush. My heart thudded at her admission, at the raw vulnerability that replaced her former arrogance. I nodded, accepting the fragile olive branch. Thank you, I said quietly. A soft murmur of approval spread as if the room exhaled collectively. My mother reached out to touch my arm, tears tracing down her cheeks. I'm sorry, son, she whispered, voice choked with regret. We never meant to hurt you. My father looked up then, eyes red-rimmed. He swallowed. Malik, he paused, the years of unspoken expectations and misdirected pride laid bare between us. I'm so sorry, he finished. The sincerity in his tone broke something open in the cool air, and for the first time in years I felt his love rather than his judgment. I stepped forward and embraced him, feeling the tremor of relief in his frame. Around us, the guests whispered, some nodding in understanding, others silently contemplating their own roles in the family's drama. Jessica joined the embrace, completing a circle of reconciliation I had feared but needed. In that moment, I realized the power of being seen, not through the lens of money or obligation, but through the clarity of truth. As we stood together, I understood that the wounds of deception could heal when acknowledgement and apology replaced denial. We lingered in the embrace, the toast's aftermath giving way to a new beginning, one in which I was no longer invisible, but at last recognized and valued for who I truly was. The week after the retirement party unfolded in a haze of uneasy emails and tentative phone calls, each ping reminding me of the new boundary I'd drawn and the lingering tension it invited. My inbox held a voice note from Dad, just a few seconds of static and his quiet apology. I didn't know. I messed up. Call me, son. I stared at the waveform, thumb hovering over play, and chose to leave it unread. Elsewhere, an apology email from Mom lay unopened in my trash folder, paragraphs of regret and explanation, but I deleted it without a second glance. Their words felt hollow after years of unspoken expectations and misplaced praise. In our living room, sunlight slanting through the blinds, Jessica watched me sift through my messages. She placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "They'll learn," she said, voice steady. Her faith in me bolstered my resolve. I would not be drawn back into a cycle of shame and obligation. Days turned into a fortnight. I didn't hear from Sienna, who had unfollowed me on social media and avoided our shared groups. I didn't receive calls from my aunt or cousin. The silence stretched like a canyon between us, but in that space I discovered a clarity I'd never known. I reclaimed my weekends, no dinners of forced smiles, no whispers behind napkins. I spent mornings reading on the balcony, afternoons at the climbing gym, and evenings cooking new recipes with Jessica. With each day, I felt less the invisible provider and more the man I wanted to be, present, respected, and free. One afternoon, my phone chimed with a calendar reminder, Dad's birthday dinner, 2 weeks away. I paused, considering whether to attend. Memories of that first humiliating Sunday flashed through me, but I also recalled the tremor of genuine apology in his voice. I turned to Jessica, who offered me a small, encouraging smile. "Only if you want to," she said. I realized I could choose the terms of my presence now. I opened my calendar and deleted the reminder. Instead, I scheduled a weekend trip for the two of us, a silent covenant of our future, unbound by old expectations. In that act of refusal, I sealed the new chapter of my life, one built on honesty, respect, and the knowledge that sometimes silence spoken loudly is the gift that frees us all.